Thank you, Anya. That was a very gracious introduction, and it's also a real pleasure for me to be here in Cologne. It's my first encounter with the city, this visit, and I've just found it to be incredibly inspiring to be here and to get to know some of the various players and other institutes associated with the Auerbach Institute. So as Anya said, this talk was motivated in part by a phrase that I could never get out of my mind, which was Hegel's idea of thought thinking itself, which I know is about as uncolorful a concept as one could possibly have. So it's odd for me as somebody who works principally on poetry to have been drawn towards it. And yet I thought that it actually presented a fascinating way of getting beyond this bypass, this impasse that we always seem to be at between res extensa and res cogitans of mind and matter, and that there was a way in which Rilke's notion of the Weltinnenraum, I thought really expanded this idea, exploded it in ways that speak very much to our concerns both about AI and climate change. And I hope some of that will become a little bit more apparent in this lecture. It will be about 50 minutes, maybe a bit less. I'll try to read slowly. If I'm going too fast, please speak up, okay? Thank you. In an article whose phrasing no doubt shows its age, Chapelle summarizes Aristotle's position on matter in the Metaphysics by saying it is, quote, a durable non-thing and a queer entity, end quote. One might be tempted to say that matter is nonsense, given its inaccessibility to thought, if this did not seem like a flippant remark to make in the face of Aristotle's repeated efforts to distinguish between matter, hula, and substance, ousia. The distinction lies at the heart of the seventh book of the Metaphysics, Book Zeta, in which Aristotle is concerned with the nature of what is and why it undergoes change. Answering these two questions ends up requiring a wholesale revision of the doctrine of hylomorphism that Aristotle himself expounded in the Categories. There he argued that although a thing may dissolve, matter persists, and its persistence allows for change, since even change must be based in something pre-existing. Yet in the Metaphysics, Aristotle takes issue with the idea that prime matter is the formless substrate or the underlying substance from which all formed substances emerge. What motivates this shift, I will argue, is the power of the noetic element. That is the realization that whatever is must simultaneously be thought to be real, actual, or immediate. This may seem like a counterintuitive point to make, and to some extent it is. One generally assumes that thought does not precede being, but follows from it. Thought digests what is given. And yet in the Metaphysics, Aristotle questions whether matter is given at all. That is, whether it exists as an independent, self-sufficient entity, or if its being is not tied to the form in which it appears and makes itself known. In Book Zeta, he argues that matter has no being except as a component of individual things, or if you prefer, the stuff of which things are made. And this position has far-reaching consequences for his conception of the universe. The universe is based in and moved by thought. It has its foundation in an unmoved mover whose sole activity lies in thinking itself, or rather in thinking itself thinking, noesis, noesios, noesis, which is not merely a circular formulation. It's a formulation, by the way, that Hegel in the conclusion of the encyclopedia cites as well. The prime mover thinks without interruption, as it is nothing but mind, nous, and the only object worthy of its attention is itself because it never changes, which amounts to saying that it is pure energia, actuality. The prime mover thinks itself, and in so doing generates an intelligible universe. A universe that can be known, explored, studied, imagined, and otherwise experienced, because it is the thought of God, which is identical with the divine mind and the unmoved mover. The world as conceived by Aristotle is no doubt remote from Rilke's. I'm not going to say the two are the same. Rilke had little faith in the power of thought to bridge the divide between subject and object, since it is thought itself which first introduces this gap. Much of the Eighth Elegy is in fact devoted to this problem, as can be gleaned from the speaker's lament that he is condemned to stand opposite as well as opposed to his surroundings. Dieses heißt Schicksal, gegenüber sein, und nichts als das, und immer gegenüber. Yet Rilke was also drawn to figures who partake of the divine and dwell in eternity because they are not hampered by the fear of death, as Rilke and most famously his alter ego Martha Lauret's Brigo were. One such figure is the shepherd in the Spanish Trilogie, a cycle of poems composed in 1913 to open the collection Gedichte an die Nacht, clearly an allusion to Novalis' Hymne an die Nacht, a cycle of poems which Rilke never completed. Written at a time when Rilke was struggling with the Duino elegies, the Spanish Trilogie sketches a mode of being in which an isolated figure becomes one with the elements, earthbound and yet cosmic. Such an existence would appear utterly physical, and yet Rilke invites us to consider whether the shepherd is not a figure for thought itself, or more forcefully, and with emphasis on the paradox, whether thought is not his nature. To be and to be thought in this poem collapse to such a degree that everything named offers a potential pathway to eternity. In what follows, I will briefly summarize Aristotle's concept of substance and its relation to the unmoved mover, fully cognizing that the topic is complex, and I will not be able to do justice to it, before I then reflect on the curious figure of the shepherd in Rilke's Spanish Trilogie, who personifies an impersonal force. First section, substance. For Aristotle, a substance, ousia, is that which answers the question, what is this? It is characterized by its thisness and what he calls its separability, which requires some explanation. A thing is separable if its existence does not depend on anything else, even if it is frequently associated with that element. For example, a person can be said to be healthy, wise, honest, and strong, but she does not need to be these things to be a person. A substance is the underlying subject or substrate, hypokaimenon, that bears these predicates, and its separability from these conditions places it on a higher level of being than any quality, quantity, or other attribute. Substance is primary, as Aristotle puts it. It is the fundamental ontological category which enables all other categories to be. To mark the difference between a substance and its predicates, Aristotle writes, and I quote, I have a German translation of the Aristotle too, which I actually think is a little bit more precise than the English, but just to keep the flow of the talk, I'll continue. The substratum is that of which everything else is predicated, while it is itself not predicated of anything else. This statement is not as difficult as it seems. The asymmetry Aristotle points to can be summarized as follows. A substance can have predicates, but cannot be a predicate for something else. For example, a person can be swift, but is not a cheetah. And a cheetah may have spots, but this does not make it a Dalmatian. This is like the most complex slide I've ever put together on PowerPoint. Aristotle does not discount that substances can resemble each other, but his point remains that they cannot be anything but themselves, which is why he characterizes them as a this, toda ti, in German ein das. Substances are particulars, not universals, and in emphasizing their concreteness, Aristotle marks his distance from the idealist extremes of Plato's philosophy, in which embodied things are nothing but weak imitations of pure forms. Still, Aristotle's realism is not as absolute as it would seem, and this becomes apparent when he considers what remains once an object has been stripped of its predicates. And in English, there's this really horrible habit of referring to this section of Book Zeta as Aristotle's stripped tease. He notes that when one lifts all properties from a substance, it would appear that nothing but matter remains. But this is, in his words, impossible for two reasons. First, if matter were the primary category of being, then substance would be a mere subset of it, a predicate that depends on matter for its existence. This is an untenable position for Aristotle, and not only because it overturns the hierarchy of beings he previously constructed. In putting matter first for Aristotle, one places what is not over what is, as he suggests when he asserts, and I quote, "By matter, I mean that which in itself is neither a particular thing, nor a particular quantity, nor designated by any of these categories which define being. In itself, matter is nothing. It lacks all positive and negative attributes, and thus is not actually something, as one Aristotle scholar asserts, with emphasis on the word actually." We'll get to this shortly. It's potentially something, but actually matter is nothing. Matter does not exist except in the objects it comprises, where it comes to be as an essential component of that object. Thus we speak of the hardness of a bronze shield, the smoothness of a marble statue, or the glimmer of a gold pendant. In each case, the attribute, hardness, smoothness, glimmer, belongs not to the material, but to the particular object in which the material takes shape. Point 2. The second reason Aristotle says that matter cannot be the principal being is because it lacks all form. And without form, it cannot be said to be anything at all. Form alone makes things intelligible, it determines what they are, and in so doing distinguishes them from all other objects. The condition for being a this, as opposed to a that, then, is form, which inheres in everything we experience, and in fact constitutes the condition for experience. Something must have form to be experienced, and it can be of the most vague or loose variety. You can go into a carpenter shop and see a pile of wood shavings, and still they have the form of pile and shavings for Aristotle. So that's how the wood makes itself felt. So the realist Aristotle ends up returning in Book Zeta to a transcendental approach in identifying form as the basis for a thing's being and intelligibility at once. Section 2, from prime matter to prime mover. A concept closely linked to form in the metaphysics is actuality, energia. Something comes to be what it is when its form becomes manifest. And this manifestation takes place in the mind, where the act of thinking and the object of thought coalesce. Aristotle does not hesitate to make this point directly in De Anima. I quote, "In the case of objects which involve no matter, what thinks and what is thought are identical." Lest one assume that Aristotle's observation is limited to immaterial objects, say mathematical concepts, it is worth noting that the process of thinking transforms even crude material objects, such as granite boulders or shards of glass, into intelligible substances. This is not to say, and this is where then potentiality now comes to the fore, this is not to say that empirical objects do not exist prior to their perception, but to specify that in their unapprehended state, they only have the status of potential objects. Thinking brings out the truth of something, its essence or form, and this essence belongs as much to the object as it does to the mind contemplating it. Both enjoy a moment of shared vitality for the duration of a thought before returning to the slumber of their potential state once the thought subsides. The oscillation between emptiness and fullness, depending on whether the mind is at rest or at work, leads Aristotle to proclaim, and this is the next quote, "Mind is in a sense potentially whatever is thinkable, though actually it is nothing until it has thought." Actually, one German translator was so bold as to say, "Nicht aber in Wirklichkeit, bevor sie die Denkgegenstände denkt." Right? So that it's only at this moment of mind thinking that it is itself actual, before then withdrawing again or retreating into potentiality. The human mind is never fully actualized because it is subject to the vagaries of the body, which determine what the human mind perceives, when it perceives it, and how long it can sustain its attention. Put otherwise, the body impinges on the mind in such a way that its capacities either remain potential or return to potentiality after a period of efflorescence. But as Aristotle reminds us, the mind is not only a receptacle for forms, for the noeta embedded in aistheta. The mind is also a maker of such forms as the active intellect, and the term he uses, which is quite curious, is nous poeticos. The nous poeticos is a concept he introduces in De Anima, but does not take up explicitly elsewhere in his work. Nonetheless, the concept is crucial in connecting the human mind with the divine mind discussed in Book 12 of the Metaphysics. In this book, Aristotle tackles what Heidegger called the fundamental question of metaphysics. Why are there beings at all instead of nothing? Warum ist überhaupt Seiendes und nicht vielmehr nichts? In Aristotelian terms, the question could be posed as, what sets the universe in motion, beginning with the heavens, which move in a continuous circle? The origin cannot be anything material, since all material things are threatened by the possibility of their disappearance and by extension of not being. That is to say, they can never be actual, since as material bodies they are always subject to change, and this suspends their being between what they are no longer and what they are not yet. Aristotle thus concludes that the only substance that can set the universe in motion must be one that is eternally itself. It can neither come from something nor tend toward something, as either option would reduce it to a potential being, a being that would have to be moved for its own fulfillment. The only substance that fits this criterion is God as mind, insofar as the divine mind is eternal, unchanging, and unceasing in the activity that is its entire being, thinking itself. How does the prime mover move the universe, as well as the individual beings that comprise it? This is one of the most vexing questions in Book 12 of the Metaphysics, and Aristotle's answer to it is as startling as it is breathtaking. I remember the first time I came across this argument, it literally did knock my breath away. I was so astonished by it. We should recall that the prime mover does not itself move, as this would imply an imperfection in its current state, a potential it is yet to realize. Rather, the prime mover sets the cosmos in motion by resting in itself. For in resting in itself, it demonstrates its perfection as the sole being that is its own source and foundation. The perfection of the unmoved mover awakens our desire. It moves in this sense and inspires us, as Aristotle indicates, when differentiating between a final cause, in German a Zweckursache, and an efficient one, a Bewegungsursache. And I quote, "The final cause then produces motion as being loved, but all other things move by being moved." So by virtue of the fact that the prime mover actually awakens our desire, it also stands then as the first cause in a way that no other thing can be a cause. It is beyond the scope of this paper to discuss the differences between an efficient and a final cause, but suffice it to say that an efficient cause accounts for changes in an object over time as part of a chain, whereas a final cause determines what a particular object ought to be. How does it fulfill its own definition? As both the principle that launches being and the final cause to which things aim, the unmoved mover elicits a desire in all things to be a good thing of their kind, or even the best thing of their kind, and to realize their potential. Humans strive to realize their nature as thinking beings, and in doing so, they come as close as any being can to unity with the divine intellect that thinks without cease. When we think, then we actually experience or undergo this unity with the divine mind, which makes then all thinking also ecstatic. The shepherd, this is where we'll get hopefully a little bit more inches filled with color as opposed to merely logic. The shepherd in Rilke's Spanish Trilogie likewise awakens a desire in the reader to be like him, to shine in and through him, as the final verse of the trilogy suggests. Sei wer immer für euch. Wie das wehende Nachtlicht in den Mantel der Lampe stell ich mich in ihn. Let him be whomever you wish, like a fluttering candle into a storm lamp. I place myself there, inside him. Countenancing the stars. Rilke wrote the Spanish Trilogy during a trip to Spain from November 1912 to February 1913, in which he passed through Toledo, Cordoba, and Seville before settling for a longer stay in Rwanda. The stay in Rwanda proved to be extraordinarily productive for him. Not only did he write the trilogy, as well as the two Erlebnis texts, which document the mystical experience in Capri that inspired the first two elegies, he also drafted portions of the sixth elegy alongside several other poems intended for a volume entitled Gedichte an die Nacht that never came to fruition. Aspects of the landscape in Toledo and Rwanda are included in the poem, as are elements from El Greco's painting Toledo, which Rilke saw at an exhibition in Paris in 1908. The painting was one of the motivations, not the sole one, but one of the motivations for his trip, which came at a time when he had an impasse in his writing following the completion of the notebooks of Montelauret's Brigge in 1910 and the composition of the first two elegies in 1912 in an outburst of creativity that did not prove to be long-lasting. Rilke goes through a sustained writer's block, writing occasional poems, but no major works between 1912 and 1922. And he wrote in endless letters to Lou Andreas Salome that, I went to my end with Malta and have been unable to write ever since. So he takes this trip, and then in 1913, to El Greco's adopted home, which signified, among other things, his desire to reevaluate his relationship with Rodin, Auguste Rodin, from whom he had learned the autonomy of things, but not the space that things share with other beings. And he famously proclaims, das Werk des Gesichts ist getan, tue ich nun das Herzwerk. Scholars generally agree that the Spanish adventure represents a turning point in Rilke's work, from the objective poetics of the new poems to the gaze of the elegies, in which the world is seen not from without, but from within. The poet's jubilant exclamation at the end of the ninth elegy is perhaps the most explicit expression of this project. Erde, ist es nicht dies, was du willst, unsichtbar in uns erstehen? Ist dein Traum nicht einmal unsichtbar zu sein? Erde, unsichtbar. It is worth noting, however, that the project transforming the earth into something invisible dates back to Rilke's visit to Spain, as he intimates in a rather amazing letter to a friend and funder, Ellen Delp, from October 1915, in which he recalls his earlier journey. This is a very long quote. I have it on the handout as well, and since I think everybody here speaks German far better than I do, I'll read it in German. Die spanische Landschaft, die letzte, die ich grenzenlos erlebt habe, Toledo, hat diese meine Verfassung zum Äußersten getrieben, indem dort das äußere Ding selbst, Turm, Berg, Brücke, zugleich schon die unerhörte, unübertreffliche Intensität der inneren Äquivalente besaß, durch die man es hätte darstellen mögen. Erscheinung und Vision kamen gleichsam über allem Gegenstand zusammen. Es war in jedem eine ganze Innenwelt herausgestellt, als ob ein Engel, der den Raum umfasst, blind wäre und in sie schaute. Dieser nicht mehr von Menschen aus, sondern im Engel geschaute Welt ist vielleicht meine wirkliche Aufgabe. Wenigstens kämen in ihr all meine früheren Versuche zusammen. Rilke's fascination with the landscape around Toledo consists in large part in the ways in which the landscape expresses an inner world. It is a world turned inside out, as is evident in his statement that in every object an entire inner world is displayed, herausgestellt. Yet even this description proves to be inadequate in that it places the inner world opposite the poet, as if it were something other than him. Rilke thus adds a further qualification which turns representation on its head, presenting nothing but presentation itself. What the poet encounters is not an object to be seen, but seeing without an object. Es war, als ob ein Engel, der den Raum umfasst, blind wäre und in sich schaute. The hypothetical formulation Rilke relies on underscores the peculiarity of the image presented, if the latter can even be called that. A blind angel sees nothing, and it is precisely the nothingness of this sight which ensures that he is one with everything, or, put otherwise, that everything constitutes his gaze, his vision. Erscheinung und Vision kamen gleichsam überall im Gegenstand zusammen. Like the divine intellect in Aristotle that is identical with every object thought, blind angel merges with everything he gazes at, for what he sees is finally nothing in the original sense of the term, no one thing. And it's interesting that the etymology of das Nichts or nichts is the same, nicht etwas, no one thing. This boundless world is the poet's interior, as conversely, his interior is a world, an external sphere of being. How can a poem do justice to a landscape that is neither inside nor outside, but both simultaneously? How can it make visible a mode of seeing that is not directed at any object, but instead generates objects in much the same manner as Aristotle's nous poeticos? These questions lie at the heart of Rilke's Spanish Trilogie, which opens with a prayer for God to make a thing that would unite self and world. And I will cite this poem. I guess I should maybe emphasize from the outset that I actually think that this poem fails, and I think it's set up to fail, so that in the second and third poems in the trilogy, Rilke can propose a different relationship to the environment than one that he says here. So, aus dieser Wolke siehe, die den Stern so wild verdeckte eben war, und mir. Aus diesem Bergland drüben, das jetzt Nachtwinde hat für eine Zeit, und mir. Aus diesem Fluss im Talgrund, der den Stein zerrissener Himmelslichtung fängt, und mir. Aus mir und alledem ein einzig Ding zu machen, Herr. Aus mir und dem Gefühl, mit dem die Herde eingekehrten Pferd das große dunkle Nicht-mehr-Sein der Welt ausatmend hinnimmt. Mir und jedem Licht im Finstersein der vielen Häuser, Herr. Ein Ding zu machen aus den Fremden, denn nicht einen kenne ich, Herr, und mir ein Ding zu machen aus den Schlafenden, den fremden alten Männern im Hospiz, die wichtig in den Betten husten, aus schlaftrunkenen Kindern an so fremder Brust, aus vielen Ungenauen und immer mir, aus nichts aus mir und dem, was ich nicht kenne, das Ding zu machen, Herr, 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 das Ding, das welthaft irdisch wie ein Meteor in seine Schwere nur die Sommerflugs zusammennimmt, nichts wiegend als die Ankunft. The critic Heta Kamberger cautions against reading the poem exclusively as a poetological statement, even if the thing in question in the poem is undoubtedly an art object, ein Kunstding. Such an approach obscures what she considers the fundamental issue at stake in the text, whether an I, a first person, can ever be reconciled with the sphere of objects that lies opposite it. To this end, she notes that the speaker, or I, is initially hidden in the text, consigned to the end of the first 6 lines and enclosed in parentheses, which isolate it from the landscape that it sketches. The poem pivots. It goes from putting the und mir last to suddenly foregrounding it in the remainder of this first poem. It is of some significance that the elements of this landscape correspond to the 4 elements: earth in Bergland, Talgrund, water in Wolke, Fluss, fire in Sterne, and air in Nachtwinde, as this correspondence speaks to the landscape's primordiality, as if it had yet to be touched by human hands and stood as it did on the day of its creation. From the 7th line onward, however, the I becomes increasingly prominent as the natural world retreats into the background as something that can hardly be named, culminating in the almost skeletal description of the landscape as viel Ungenaues and das, was ich nicht kenn. For Hamburger, the thingly character of the objective sphere remains in the poem, if it remains at all, in the word things itself, which takes on a hard and blunt sound, according to her, through its insistent repetition. The weightiness that the word acquires as she has it allows it to be compared to a meteor that gathers within its heaviness no more than the sum of flight and weighs nothing but arrival, nicht speaking of Ankunft. Yet it remains questionable whether the thing that the speaker wishes for ever arrives, whether his prayer, which consists in one long, unfinished sentence, is ever answered. And this whole poem is a sentence fragment. It never actually is able to arrive at that point. Obviously, that would be the thing itself, presumably, that would make the speaker's utterance then null and void. The poem is weighed down by the dualist heritage that it bears, which not only separates subject and object, but also requires a third term to mediate between them. This requirement places the poem in conflict with itself. The speaker can only announce his wish for something that would bridge the subject-object divide by turning what he wants into an object opposite him. In other words, he can only express his desire for unity with the natural world by distancing himself from that world in an almost Sisyphean struggle. So that every time he repeats the wish, please, Lord, make me one with the world, make me this thing in which I can live with the world, he actually sort of sets himself further apart, which is why this I becomes ever more pronounced as the poem proceeds, rather than disappearing in the thing that is in fact called for. This paradox accounts for the increasingly desperate tone of the text, as well as the increased emphasis on the I. Repetitive and awkward lines like aus nichts aus mir und dem, was ich nicht kenn, das Ding zu machen, Herr, das Ding, are unusual in Rilke's poetry, otherwise known for its consummate musicality. Yet, even in this most unmusical of texts, sound ends up signaling something distinct from what the speaker says. It speaks between his words in an internal rhyme, Binnenreim, and in so doing attunes us to something that belongs to neither the subject nor the object. And I point your attention to the lines, ein einzig Ding zu machen, Herr, aus mir und dem Gefühl, mit dem die Herde eingekehrt im Vers, das große Dunkle nicht mehr sein der Welt ausatmen hinnimmt. Beneath the percussive beats produced by the one-syllable word ding lies the extended A sound in Herr, Herde, eingekehrt, Vers, nicht mehr sein, and so forth, which attest to the breath that carries the poem, even if we are scarcely aware of it. Indeed, no matter how much we squint our eyes or strain our ears, we will never make this breath present. Like the herd returning to its pen at night, we simply take it in. Or rather, we let it be while exhaling, ausatmend, and thus contributing to the air we share with everything. The birds, for example, which Rilke tells us in another poem, fliegen still durch uns hindurch. Air is in us as that which animates us and outside us, as that which moves clouds and wafts as wind, hence the Wolke and the Nachtwinde in the beginning of the first poem. But otherwise, it lingers in things as well as encompasses them, making it at once immanent and transcendent. In the second and third poems of the trilogy, this pneumatic element returns in the form of a shepherd, which may seem like an odd statement to make until one realizes that this shepherd is as vast as the sky and as expansive as the earth, and to this extent is not a shepherd at all, but an allegory. From the moment the shepherd is introduced, a vagueness attaches to him, as if he lacked all contours that would separate him from his environment. And I quote, Warum muss einer dastehen wie ein Hielt, so ausgesetzt dem Übermaß von Einfluss, beteiligt so an diesem Raum voll Vorgang, dass gelehnt in einem Baum der Landschaft sein Schicksal hätte, ohne mehr zu handeln. Und hat doch nicht im viel zu großen Blick die stille Milderung der Herder, hat nichts als Welt, halt in jedem Aufschauen, in jeder Neigung weh. What begins in these verses as a question about the shepherd's lot in life quickly becomes a reflection on why he has no fate at all. So exposed is he to the forces that exceed him, diesen Übermaß von Einfluss, that he all but dissolves, becoming a part not merely of the landscape, but of this event-filled space, diesem Raum voll Vorgang. This applies even at moments when he would appear to achieve a certain fixity, such as when he is pictured leaning against a tree, for even here he lacks what would distinguish him from the tree and thus allow him to be visible as a figure, the will to act. It can be there ohne mehr zu handeln. Like the blind angel Rilke refers to in his letter to Ellen Delp, who encompasses all space, the shepherd looks blankly into a world that could at the same time be his interior. For he possesses nothing that would constitute an inside. He has no properties, characteristics, or aims that would give a particular cast his existence. Even his herd is a matter of indifference to him. Whatever he encounters is consequently his inside and outside at once. It is both his being and the being of the cosmos, which he generates through his viel zu großen Blick, as if he were the prime mover. What becomes visible in this otherwise invisible figure are the stars. Da steht nächtens auf und hat den Hof des Vogels draußen schon in seinem Dasein und fühlt sich kühn, weil die ganzen Sterne in sein Gesicht nimmt. Schwer, oh nicht wie einer, der Geliebten dieser Nacht bereitet und sie verwöhnt mit dem gefüllten Himmel. In much the same manner as the birds sound in the very being of the shepherd, so too the stars shine in his face. The second poem turns on the double meaning of the word Gesicht. The stars that the shepherd takes in with his gaze, which is one reading of the phrase in sein Gesicht nehmen, or in another reading, taken into his face, impressed on his countenance as if the latter were the expanse of the sky, and what glimmered there were the stars that make up the constellation Boötes, the shepherd, with which Rilke was likely familiar. I only discovered this, by the way, a week ago because of all the discussion of northern lights. And so I haven't fully worked this out yet in my text. But Rilke, loved inventing constellations, and the 10th elegy famously ends with an inventory of invented constellations. So I have every reason to believe that he would have been very interested in Boötes too, and this another way in which the shepherd is both earthly and cosmic, and that what he sees is also what is seen in and through him. If you're wondering, that little half of a hexagon at the bottom, I guess it's supposed to be the plow that the shepherd moves. So what the shepherd looks at is not something other than himself then. He is himself, the night sky, as a being that, like Rilke's angel, stares into himself, in sich schaut. Rilke transforms Aristotle's idea of a divine intellect that in thinking generates an intelligible world into the image of a shepherd that in gazing generates a space for objects to appear. While it may be tempting to say that this space is inside the shepherd, a more apt formulation would be that this space is the shepherd's entire being. To borrow a figure from the poem, his face, Gesicht, is the face of the universe, and hence the title of my talk, Countenancing the Stars. Rarely has a poet tried to visualize an idea as abstract as this, to give monism plastic form. Whether this can even be done is a question the third poem takes up. The third poem begins with a retrospective glance. The speaker recalls the countryside and the shepherd after having returned to the city. Yet the poem is hardly nostalgic for rural life, even as it complains about the noise and congestion of the city in a lament all too typical for Rilke. The poem avoids this impulse by reflecting on not what the shepherd is, but what he could be, and more importantly, whether the poet could ever assume his task. So here's the poet imagining what would it be like to be a shepherd. And we have echoes of the meteor in the first poem now coming back in the third. Steinig sei mir zumut, und das Tagwerk des Hirten scheine mir möglich, wie einer einhergeht und bräunt und mit messendem Steinwurf seine Herde besäumt, wo sie sich ausfranst. Langsamen Schrittes, nicht leicht, nachdenklichen Körpers, aber im Stehen ist er herrlich. Noch immer dürfte ein Gott heimlich in dieser Gestalt und wurde nicht minder. Abwechselnd weilt er und sieht wie selber der Tag, und Schatten der Wolken durchgehen ihn, als dichte der Raum langsam Gedanken für ihn. The speaker does not hesitate to conflate his work with that of a shepherd who throws stones to ensure the border of his herd does not fray, ausfransen, in an all but explicit allusion to the trope of a text as textile. Yet the analogy is forced, and not only because the idea of a poet as a shepherd is so patently self-serving for the speaker. The analogy unravels, ausfranst, as soon as it becomes apparent that the shepherd is not a simple herdsman, but an earthly being who moves, if he moves at all, wie selber der Tag. The line, im Stehen ist er herrlich, is not merely a tribute to his majesty as a figure unaffected by human affairs. The formulation could not be more precise. It encapsulates his transformation from a hielt to a Herr, who constitutes the immobile point around which everything in this text revolves. The Herde, as well as the Erde buried in this one word, and the Himmel, which is named in the third poem, and likewise begins with an aspirated H. I think it would be quite interesting to look at how Rilke takes them, what would be sort of a real sort of just typical sort of Christological statement about the transformation from a hielt to a Herr, and turns this into what you might want to call a kind of pantheism, but certainly a way, it brings it down, as it were, where the earth is actually the heavens. It would be another point to sort of look at in this poem. All these phenomena, so Herde, Erde, Himmel, all these phenomena owe their being to the shepherd, who, like Aristotle's unmoved mover, does nothing but think, and in so doing gives rise to an intelligible universe. Seen in this light, it matters little whether the shadows of the cloud pass through the shepherd, or conversely, he through them. So disembodied has he become, so bound up with everything he engenders, that one would not be mistaken to speculate that it was als dichte der Raum langsam Gedanken für ihn, as if space was thinking slowly thoughts for him. The third poem no longer envisions the shepherd as a discrete figure, but as an immaterial being that imbues all things while also containing them. This is a vision that can scarcely be represented in plastic form. Rilke nonetheless finds an image for this otherwise unimaginable thought. And quote again, sei wer immer für euch, wie das wehende Nachtlicht in den Mantel der Lampe stell ich mich in ihn. The trilogy concludes with an invitation to the reader to reside in the being that resides in all things, to taste, as it were, this transcendence. Thank you for your patience also in this very hot evening in this room.